everyone. My name is Kyna McClenaghan. I'm a PhD student in Film and Media Studies here at UCSB, and I'm here with Nicole Newnham, who is the director of this film, and we're just excited to get to talking about this beautiful documentary, which I was just saying is so lovely to see on the big screen. So let's get started.
Great.
So I'm just curious how you came across this subject matter to begin with. What's the origin story for finding out about Shere Hite in the first place?
Well, I read her obituary in 2020 in the New York Times, and the headline was something to the effect of Shere Hite. She explained how women orgasm, and she was hated for it. And it really stopped me in my tracks, you know, because it kind of put me in this like time travel tunnel where I was suddenly 12 years old and I was finding the Hite Report on my mother's bedside table, where she hid everything she didn't want me to see, you know, having to do with sex. And I tried to read some of the other books that were very technical about sexuality that were in there, but when I read the Hite Report, it was like going through the wardrobe in Narnia or something to this, you know, whole land of sort of female sexuality that, you know, basically, otherwise I didn't really have any access to at all. Even at that time in the 70s, you know, our parents were being very lax with us, and I would see erotic movies at friends' houses and things like that, but I didn't have any way of making sense of it. And there was something about those women's voices and the spectrum of experience, which was, you know, gay and straight and this and that, and knowing that that was normal, that really made an impression on me. And then I noticed when I was thinking back after reading the obituary, I realized that I still only know that other women feel the same way I do or feel differently than I do because of that book, you know? It's not like I'm sitting around talking to my friends. Unfortunately, the age of CR groups had passed by the time I got into college, although I did catch one speculum workshop at Oberlin College before they went out of fashion, and the backlash happened in the 80s, and by the end of the 80s, I was one of those college girls that you see in there saying like, oh, I don't want to call myself a feminist, you know. It took a while for me to come back around to it, and I realized looking at all this material years later that I had really kind of drunk that Kool-Aid. So I really wanted to know when I read that obituary, who was she? How did she do that work, you know? Why did she do that work? And how did she disappear? You know, why is she completely absent from our cultural conversation? And luckily there was a 35-year-old executive at NBC News Studios who also read the obituary, and then from her perspective was like, oh my God, I studied feminism at Cornell. Why did I never hear of Shere Hite? And she went in the NBC News archive and typed in Shere Hite, and this huge list of archival material popped up, as though she had typed in Princess Diana or something, you know? And she was like, oh my God, she was on TV like every week. She was on all the major shows. Like, it's crazy what happened to her. And somehow, by some, you know, amazing coincidence, we ended up having a conversation and realizing that we were both interested in making the same film. So I partnered with them, and that's how the enterprise was born.
Wow, that's a great story. Love the NBC anecdote. It is insane that there's so much archival material even that we see on screen, just from various sources, even if it's not archival footage directly connected to Shere Hite herself. That kind of tone and style of the archive and of film itself just carries through the whole storytelling. So I'm curious what kind of archives you went to. It looks like there are many that are listed at the end, and I know there's one dedicated to Shere Hite herself that she donated. So can you tell us about what the archival research was like? It looks like there was a lot to comb through.
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning, you know, we had this key, you know, source material from NBC, and they had not only filmed a bunch of interviews with her, including that one in the basement apartment that you see at the beginning of the film, with Betty Rollin, who passed away this year, along with Bob Gottlieb. So it's kind of moving to me to see them again watching the film tonight. But they then went back and did a kind of gotcha piece when they went to Europe and filmed her in London, and tried to investigate, what happened, why did she leave the States, why wouldn't anyone publish her books, and was she a fraud or not, kind of a thing. And they had all the raw material of that, so we were able to repurpose it, including like that beautiful footage of her and her husband in Germany, which I think she must have shadow directed, because I just imagine her saying to the B-roll cameraman, would you put me in the audience and I'll look thoughtfully like I'm in a Fassbinder film while my husband is playing piano in the foreground, So we had those things, and then she had negotiated before she died to give her archive to the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, and they had been starting to digitize it, but COVID happened and there was a shutdown, and we hired this incredible Harvard undergraduate named Alejandro Duarte, and he worked with us, hours and hours every week for, about a year, going in and looking at everything and taking pictures of it on his phone and sending it to us and organizing it, and then we cataloged it, and we went through, I think we read almost every paper that was in her archive, and it was everything from scribbles on the back of Post-it notes to, she would write about sexuality on opera programs, and she would write about operas, in her research notes, and it was very disorganized. She had started writing her autobiography, or something that would maybe become an autobiography, really kind of contemporaneously with her entrance into the women's movement. Even at that point, she realized she had kind of an extraordinary story, leaving graduate school and being a model and finding her way into the movement. Even before she started doing the research, she was writing drafts of her story. So we were able to find versions of her story that were really like her actual reflections not long after having experienced something like having Jacques Barzin, talk down to her. And that, I think, really helped to bring her as a full person to life for us. And then I think we were able to translate that, in the film by doing the work that we did with Dakota Johnson, in the voice. So it was like archaeology, like just these little tiny scraps and piecing them together to make a full human out of the caricature that she'd been reduced to. And we wanted to give people a feeling of that in the film, and that's why you see so many scraps and types and all the handwriting, all that kind of tactile stuff. We felt was also an important part of humanizing her and showing that she was a kind of, showing women's work, showing how women work.
Yeah, so in that same vein, what can you say to us about the feminine aesthetic of the film? I really appreciated that there were literal scraps of paper that were shown, and we follow her handwriting in that red pen that makes a statement itself. So what can you tell us about that process of making that aesthetic really come through on screen?
I mean, the more we became so aware of how, I've never in my life, had a subject in a documentary, and I've been doing it for a long time, where almost every single person I interviewed about her talked about her color palette. They were like, well, Shere had this color palette. She had this, this goldenrod and verdigris and rose, so we hired a colorist, this woman who does these incredible, she does work on these, highbrow ads, and I managed to convince her to work for not as much as she makes doing Nike ads, working on this film, and we actually colored all the archival to highlight those colors, so everything was in her color palette. As we reached out and started contacting people whose names would be written on the back of a photo, we'd be like, okay, Mike Wilson, who's that? And we would try to find who Mike Wilson, and we had these intrepid women producers who actually would track these guys down, and then they would be like, oh yeah, I have 10 boxes of photographs of Shere in my garage, because when she went to Europe, she said, you can have all the photographs we took together, but a lot of them haven't been printed yet, that kind of thing. They were just falling from the sky. It was so much beautiful material. So we really wanted the film to reflect her embracing of this maximalist feminine style that she struggled with so much at the time, but she persisted with, because it was how she felt and it was who she was. And she wanted to borrow from all these beautiful things in history, the Rachmaninoff, that we use in the score. There's harp in there. There's all these, we knew what classical music she loved. People also knew her playlist, you know. So so yeah, it was a way of us reflecting back, like her embracing of her femininity as a political statement. And our cinematographer, we had two, a French woman and an American woman who's a trans woman, and she was totally into Shere and the style and the sort of self-creation and embracing of an inner truth. And so Rose, the DP, and I worked together a lot and came up with this idea of shooting in 16 millimeter. The people that she loves, like Regina Ryan, her editor, so they are also kind of in this kind of soft style. Mm-hmm. And ultimately the conceit is like she is, and hopefully in the film feels like she's the heroine of like a, you know, like a woman's picture. Like she's a complex woman. And James Hamilton, her Village Voice boyfriend, said to me that those women in those films that she loved, they were always in control until they weren't. And so we tried to bring that a little bit into the structure of the film too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I have to bring up the point in the film when she talks about mixing paint colors, since you talked about her color palette and how she was mixing this rose color and a gold color, and she really remembered painting and mixing those colors more than the actual sex she had with the person. So that got me thinking about what is female camaraderie to her, because that's something that really comes throughout the film. We start with this procession around her celebration of life at the beginning of the film, and at the end we're really highlighting this relationship with a female photographer, and she identifies as bisexual but also seems to just be surrounded by so many women who are part of the movement. So I'm curious how you saw female camaraderie and her relationship to other women in this film.
Well, she herself in her later writings, when she was living in Europe and whatnot, she wrote a lot about how she kind of romanticized and remembered so fondly the feeling she had being part of the women's movement. And I think, you know, there are plenty of things that one can say that are truthfully, you know, that are true, that are critical of the second wave women's movement. But there also was so much of that people were finding for the first time, and Shere really experienced being transformed by movement building. And because the film was coming out in a time of the reversal of Roe and all of that, like, I thought a lot about how do I want to leave people at the end of this film. And of course, it's devastating to think about the cycle of, you know, the erasure of female knowledge over and over again, and the fact that we're back in the same place. But what Shere herself said in one of her writings was, you know, I think the only thing to do is to get back out on the street and organize. And so we did try to show that aspect of her life, you know, the strength she found in female camaraderie, and also male. I mean, I really genuinely don't think she thought in, she was very prescient in terms of how she thought about gender and gender fluidity and everything, you know, and and of her male friends, she demanded a lot, and they were excited by, you know, by trying to free themselves from some of that too. So, so yeah, I think, I mean, we sort of begin the film with her falling into the feminist movement and then end by kind of coming back to it, and that's, you know, that's really intentional. I think she herself saw her story in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you mentioned her always wanting to go back to organizing, back to the streets, as it were. So I really was interested in her position, having almost one foot in both worlds. And I'm going to read one of the quotes that I thought was particularly funny and very true, rang very true, which was that she's talking about her time in Columbia, and she says, "The movement's intellectual debates made Columbia universities look pale and anemic," which is pretty, you know, damning. So she really occupies this space as a public intellectual. She's somebody who's able to traverse multiple worlds, whether it's academic, whether it's really actually just in protest, and even just women's lib parties, what have you. How do you see her positioning, I guess, along this spectrum of the university and the political possibility of the university versus organizing more broadly?
I mean, I think her experience and the truth of her work is that she was able to do something by freeing herself from the confines of academia at Columbia. She was able to do something new and groundbreaking that hadn't been done before, that was hugely transformational. I talked to a guy that she sat in a graduate seminar with after the Hite Report came out. She went back and tried again to go to Columbia, and again she was sidelined and ridiculed. And he said that people would sit in the class and laugh at her makeup and her hair and her clothes and titter about how she wasn't really as smart as she had come across. But he said it's crazy to think back on it, because he said we were all living in Shere Hite's world. Like, they had all read the Hite Report, and they were all having great sex with their girlfriends because of it, you know? And they knew that. They knew that she had changed the world, and yet they were still sidelining her and ridiculing her. And he actually wrote kind of a hit piece on her in an Irish paper about 15 years later. And when I talked to him, he actually wept thinking about it, you know? So I think it's hard. I mean, one thing that became clear to me in looking back at it is just how vicious the kind of right-wing propaganda that started to come out against feminism and was, and how much that had seeped into the media and into, you know, all of our ways of looking at things. And I think he was feeling the same way. But back to the academic thing, Shere would always say, you know, well, when people would talk about her sample size, she would say, well, Freud had a sample size of 3 women. And people let him get away with that. You know, like, why can't I be a person who kind of comes up with a novel way of doing things, you know? And I've spoken to so many women who were trying to do qualitative research in that era who've seen this film and told me that they suffered as well, you know, in their departments, et cetera. So I just feel grateful that she kept at it, and that she did it, and that we got to benefit from it, you know. And I still have young women coming up to me after screenings and telling me that the basic biology that's revealed in the film about female orgasm is news to them, you know. So
yeah, our sex education is I don't know, pretty woeful, in a woeful state. Yeah. So not surprised to hear that. So just maybe continuing along the lines of public reception, how she was received. Some of the more troubling footage that we see maybe is the all-male audience at the Oprah show, or Anita Bryant talking about homosexual recruitment and the fear for children of America. Where do you think that we would she would still experience this kind of blowback today, this kind of feedback, or have things changed? Where do you see, how do you think she'd be received today?
I mean, you know, it's interesting if you look at somebody like Taylor Swift, you know, we're at a point where we can acknowledge that she's a business person and she's powerful, and we can look at her in a way that, you know, we were not looking at female artists then, you know, but she still has a really hard time of it. You know, she's still like attacked on a daily basis. It's still like a very present thing she has to deal with. So I can't believe I'm talking about Taylor Swift, but I think it would be the same for Shere. You know, I mean, I still think it's I still think the double standard is alive and well, and in some ways I think we've become less comfortable talking about sexuality, and that's, you know, that struck us a lot immediately when we started looking at the archival footage, because I mean, don't you think it's shocking to see like Geraldo Rivera and other mainstream anchors sitting there talking about clitoral stimulation, you know, on mainstream nightly programs? Like, it, you know, that would never happen now. I spoke to a lot of women who work around, you know, trying to promote the clitoris to be, you know, like artists and activists who are trying to break down the sort of stigma against saying that word and talking about it. But like, I was at Sundance on a Planned Parenthood panel of filmmakers when this film came out, and when I said clitoral stimulation, the entire audience tittered, and like somebody went, oh, you know, like that. So, and I'm not blaming them. I just think we're not used to it. We don't talk about it. We don't address it. These women working and writing about it are often completely censored, you know. But we're scared to talk with me on camera about that because they didn't want to slag off publications that they still had some hope might one day publish their word and publish the word clitoris more often, you know? So yeah, my whole team working on the film, we were very diverse, multi-generational group of men and women. We all feel like we had to learn ourselves how to talk about it comfortably so that we could talk about it with each other, you know, in the making of the film. So that was one of my big hopes for getting this work and this film out in the world.
Right, and I remember Shere saying that the people who were reporting on these things were heroes in their own right because so many presses wouldn't even print the word clitoris or orgasm even. And this was, I think that we still have that sense of censorship now, although, you know, some things have changed in other ways.
They have.
Yeah, thankfully. So this brings me to some of the more, talking about the clinical terminology, it brings me to the topic of how her work was scrutinized as unscientific, and especially compared to Masters and Johnson and Kinsey and their sample sizes and what have you. So talk a little bit about that discourse around why she was subject to this kind of scientism, this male scientism, as I would call it.
Yeah, I mean, you still still see that so much today, and you know, like I said, I mean, I think that she was subject to such a, I mean, that was kind of the point of showing that crazy Leave It to the Women show, right? Was that why is Buck Rogers suddenly an expert on social science methodology with all kinds of statistics in his back pocket that he's ready to, you know, to lob at Shere Hite? And why is he the one being asked to, you know, critique her work in that regard? So I was at a screening not too long ago, and a woman came up and kind of pushed her husband in front of her and made him talk to me and tell me this story about how he was a psychologist and he had written a book, not unlike Shere's male book, you know, surveying men about sexuality and writing about male sexuality. That was a pretty big book, and he said, you know, he never got asked a question about the validity of his methodology. I've also had men doing that kind of qualitative research come up and say, you know, that was part of our reason for showing her sheets, you know, her tabulation sheets and all of that, and kind of showing the work was to show that it's work, not that it can't be critiqued. I mean, I think it's perfectly valid to say, well, if you're not saying, you know, which of the questions each respondent answered, which she did because she wanted somebody to be able to fill out the survey and not answer a question that would make them feel uncomfortable, then how can you know, how valid are your percentages? All of those are things that are fine to talk about, but to use it to completely invalidate the work, which was clearly ultimately just giving people a voice who hadn't had a voice and giving us a glimpse at people's truths and people's real lives, you know, is incredibly sad. And I didn't want to turn Shere Hite into a martyr, because I don't think she was one, and I don't think she would have liked that. But I was always struck by how willing she was to suffer in order that other people could remain anonymous and thereby share their truths. So.
Yeah, so you just said you didn't want to make her into a martyr. So how did you contend with looking at a single person's life, but finding that all of these other people were rallying around her and she was supporting them in the movement? Did you come across any particular personas that really got you excited about seeing the dimensions of the movement beyond Shere's work? I know we see Flo Kennedy a few times, where they're just people that kind of kept coming around who were in her orbit that you could tell us a little bit more about.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, they're in the film, but I mean, you know, all of them should have their own film. You know, I mean, Carla J should have her own film. I mean, she played an enormously important role, actually, in like the, you know, lesbian and gay civil rights movement in New York at that time. She was actually present at a protest, like lesbian dance, where that was raided. She, which, you know, she calls, you know, our Stonewall. That is a story that almost nobody knows. That should be a film. Flo Kennedy should definitely have a film. And actually, to be honest with you, there was a lot more Flo Kennedy in my film at one point. And then I looked at it and I thought, no, I think I don't want to, like, I want to let someone else make Flo Kennedy's film. But you know, she was incredible. And those were like ties that we had archival evidence to you know, to let us know how close they were to Shere and how important a lot of those people were to her, including like Gloria Steinem. And so that's why they're kind of like briefly floated in as being a part of Shere's orbit. But if you look in the archive, you see a lot of correspondence and a lot of documentation of really, you know, alive thinking. And it was so interesting to me that she was so capable of being like completely supportive of Flo and Coyote, but on the other hand, she was actually literally funding Andrea Dworkin, you know, and her work. So she sort of, she was a founder of Women Against Pornography, actually. And then, but at the same time, you know, she was supportive of sex workers. So again, I just don't think she did not fall naturally into categories in any way, and that enabled her to be to have like a really broad spectrum of people that she connected to and talked to. We even found fan letters that she wrote to people like Madonna later in her life, asking Madonna to go out and have an espresso with her in Paris because she really admired her fashion, which I think you can imagine from, you know, what you've seen here. So yeah, it was fascinating, that whole, and we could have, you know, made the film an hour longer with all of it.
Yeah, if not longer. I'm sure you had so many archival sources. I'm sure it could go on forever.
Yeah.
So while we're talking about all of the various movements and organizations she was a part of, I see a distinct connection to your last film, Crip Camp, that we showed here. So this is a film, for those who haven't seen it, about the disability rights movement and how it was impacted significantly by a formative summer camp in the 70s. So I'm just wondering, what kind of conversation do you see happening between these two films? There's certainly a temporal connection. They're both connected by activism, but what do you have to say about how they're connected?
I had a great experience when Denise from Crip Camp, who I don't know if you remember, but she was actually got her master's degree in human sexuality, and that was her ticket out of the Bronx. And she tells some kind of incredible feminist stories about being a disabled woman and dealing with discrimination in the, you know, medical field, and almost leading to, you know, her dying at one particular point. But then she's also just this completely free spirit, pro-sex person. And she came to see this film. And so when we talked for a few hours afterwards, and I just think there is so much in so many ways. And sometimes I would almost feel like I was confused about which film I was working on because they're so interrelated. I think they are about community, as you pointed out, and the importance of movement building and community and sustaining it. They're about people discovering experiences of marginalization and structural oppression out of isolation, coming together. I mean, at the camp, that's how people started talking to each other and realizing that their problems were structural. Shere Hite's book kind of did that for women, right? And women could suddenly see, oh, it's not me, it's the system. And so, I think they're really related in that way too. And ultimately, it's just they're both about agency, bodily autonomy, and I think they're similar in terms of how they let the audience see how people are being seen through stereotypes and wrong lenses through the eyes of the people in the film, who are trying to shake that off and sort of hopefully, letting you see something through different eyes than you have before. And in this case, in that case, it was, people with disabilities, and the Jim and I were, Jim Lebrecht, who I made Crip Camp with, when we started working on the film, I asked him what his goal was, and he said, I want people to see people with disabilities as people, I think in this case, it was more kind of like Shere Hite and the history of feminism, that I wanted people to see differently, but they're similar in that way too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious, since we have talked about what you haven't been asked before in previous interviews, is there anything that you haven't been able to talk about besides what I've asked you, that you've wanted to bring up, like a fun anecdote or anything about the film that you feel like is a missed opportunity that isn't talked about too often in interviews?
There's a scene that we cut that I had to leave on the cutting room floor that I love to talk about, which is the Persian shop. She had this shop she went to on Madison Avenue. James Hamilton told me about it, and I walked into the shop, and the people working in the shop, it's a Lebanese family's shop that's like one of the last remaining real stores on Madison Avenue, and it's been there forever, and they sell Persian antiques and jewelry and beautiful things, and the man who started the store was a couturier in the 1950s, and he and Shere worked together to construct her outfits. And so all of that incredible, like, gold and silver thread silk that you see in her apartment and in her suits and whatnot, that was all from him. And so I had built this, like, gorgeous scene of how they worked together and how she had constructed her outfits and her ensembles and kind of become Shere Hite, and it was way too much. So I had to cut it out, but it was really beautiful and really and again, I think just an example of her kind of, I read something she wrote early on in New York that she wanted to dye her hair red and curl it because she wanted to look ethnic. She had come from such a completely restrictive, oppressive background that was completely homogenous, and New York was really freeing for her, and I was building this whole elaborate scene to try to say that, and then Gene Simmons said it. And it was much shorter to just put in a quote from Gene Simmons, which I never would have thought would have been the case. But it was, and again, it's like, Shere wasn't going to be judging Gene Simmons, she was going to be asking him questions, and she was going to be pulling insights out of him, and it was really fun to get to meet him and get to see him fall into, as he remembered the questions she asked him and stuff, he got really reflective and insightful, and I hope she's a model for being more like that.
Yeah. So I will ask one more question before we hand it off to the audience. What is the utility of this story today? And I know that's a very big question. But I'm wondering if we're in the same fight here, if we're still fighting for the same things that Shere Hite was, she was trying to advocate for. At one point, she even said she wanted to learn history because she couldn't understand today. Do you share that goal? Was that kind of a motivation for this film? How do you see this film as important right now, today?
I mean, it's incredibly important right now today. I mean, it's very scary out there right now. And like I said, I mean, we were filming when the Dobbs decision got leaked, and now I've been screening this in red states where, people are coming up and talking to me about horrific things that have happened to people they know and love because of the abortion restriction laws. And so I think these stories are incredibly, unfortunately, like urgently important today. But I would really love to ask you that question too, Like, what do you think?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think just the political landscape of today, especially after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, makes this an incredibly necessary film and intervention, something that can be used as a teaching tool, something that makes it accessible. The idea of even clitoral stimulation to larger audiences. Clearly, all of the attempts to make these ideas accessible we're still fighting that same battle, and I think documentary is a really unique platform to be able to reach a broader audience in that way. So I absolutely think it's incredibly urgent. Maybe not exactly the same fight, but same song, different verse. I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Emily Zinn, who I think is going to facilitate our Q&A with the audience.
Thanks for being here, and thanks for an incredible film. It was really very striking. I wanted to talk about the voicing of her voice, what Dakota depicted her voice. It struck me as such a monotonic, almost dysthymic depiction of her, and she's talking about a subject people get obviously very emotional and wrapped around, and yet she's this, depicted as having this very monochromatic or monotonic, very unemotional presence. So was that you or was that Dakota? I mean, certainly reflected some of the actual interviews, but that seemed to me such a striking part of the film that really, I'm curious to see what your reaction is to that.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because my experience of Dakota's read is that it's actually more, like in a degree, it's a little more emotional than the way Shere talks, which is very, like you say, it's very kind of pulled back. In fact, I had conversations with my editor at the beginning of cutting the film about, like, would she hold a whole movie, or was she too cool or cold or weird or something, And it was really in going through all that archival material that we started to really, and just finding little things like her giggling and laughing, and where you start, very late in the game we got that footage from Canada where she's in that little pineapple shirt with her dog, and and we were like, oh my God, there she is, that's the person. So what I discussed with Dakota was, that this should be Shere's internal monologue. It wasn't Shere projecting or emoting to other people, but it was her, like a reflection of how she might be thinking if she was writing these things, which is what they all were. They were all like her writings and her reflections, you know what I mean? And she said, do I have to talk like Shere? Do I have to, and she kind of did a funny little imitation of Shere. And I said, no, you really don't. Like, I just want it to be intimate, and reflective. And so she did that, and she was wonderful, and we cut it in, and the editor and I were just like beside ourselves, because it seemed to bring so much more to the film than the temporary narration we had in there, and we kind of couldn't believe it. But what we were surprised when we premiered the film and people started, a lot of people felt like it was an almost perfect match, between Shere and Dakota, and that was not something that we had heard at all. And I think it's actually just that she's a really good actress, you know? Her voice isn't dissimilar to Shere's, but I think she kind of nailed her character and emotion just in this really subtle way that I think is really fluid, and I'm incredibly grateful to her. She really loved Shere. She already knew about her when I approached her, and she said, I would like to go out to dinner with Shere Hite tonight if I could. She's my kind of person, and I'll do anything to help get her story out into the world. So yeah, she was great.
First of all, thank you for making the film. Admittedly, like, I kind of tagged along here with my roommate, who is a film major, Anna. Thank you. But it was a very pleasant, like, watching experience. But I was just wondering, like, when you first started making this film, did you talk to the women in your life or the men in your life, like, about it, about Shere? Were you like, do you know her? And did those, like, whether they did know her or didn't, did that make you think, like, okay, this is how I have to introduce her? I have to introduce her as, like mono or like very expressive, like I have to, or do I have to like lull them in? Did that like have any impact on your creative like experience, or was it just kind of like you knew from the beginning?
That's a really good question. When you said that, when you asked that question, the thing that flashed in my mind was that my husband was telling a friend of his that I was working on this film, and I was like washing dishes or something, and I was kind of listening to him tell his friend about it. And when he finished, his friend laughed, and he said, really? That's what Nicole's working on? How do you think that's going to make you look? And I thought, oh my God, like things are worse than I thought, you know? This is going to be really hard. And it was kind of awkward, actually. And I did get a lot of kind of like eyebrow raise, just people raising their eyebrows from the older generation. And actually, it was the older people, and by that I mean like my age, where there was more resistance. Like for instance, older women that we showed early cuts to said, I really think you need to tone down her apartment. Because when we get to the point where she has this fancy apartment and she's wearing all these fancy clothes, then I stop trusting her. And I think, is she only doing this for the money? You know? And then I would show it to younger women, and they were like, that was badass when she got that apartment, and it was great. And I was like, go Shere, you know? Like, how great that she got to live in that palace, you know, and that she made it so beautiful. So we were like checking in with people kind of all the way along and kind of moderating it, you know. I think when you make a film about somebody who's not being seen for what they really are, you have to do that. Like in Crip Camp, we would show things to people that we thought they would be like, wow, right on. And they would say like, oh, that was so really touching and kind of sad when that person did that. And we would be like, okay, back to the drawing board. We've got to recut that scene, you know? And I think in doing that, we were not only like learning about how other people saw people through inaccurate lenses, but also we were kind of unpacking our own stuff, you know? So my first instinct when people were criticizing the apartment scene was to pull back on it, but then really thinking about it and talking to more people, kind of I realized like I carry that about, you know. I don't know, like who would ever say that about a guy? If you saw some guy and he suddenly had an amazing apartment, you'd just think like, oh yes, well that's when he became successful and famous, you know. So yeah, it's a lot of that like trial and error and learning all along the way.
Thank you so much for this extraordinary film, which I found just deeply moving because as a, you know, second wave feminist, you know, it just brought back so much. And one of the things, and I'm taking off from the question that was just asked and what you just answered, we saw in the film so much ambivalence on the part of men, and you just gave ambivalence to say it nicely. And you just gave it as an example, you know, of ambivalence on the part of men today, you know, to this. But watching the film, I so remembered, and I want to ask you about this, the ambivalence among women toward Shere Hite. And of course, we know the feminist sex wars, the feminist porn wars, and all that. And just, I have to say, it brought back, you know, a kind of bad memory, you know, of just how often it would be feminists, you know, who would have this just extraordinary anxiety around sexuality and about female sexual agency.
Yeah.
And so I wonder how, if you could just talk a bit about how you negotiated that, because it's kind of painful, you know, to see the extreme ambivalence, if not hostility, of women in the film, of feminists in the film, toward her openness about her sexuality, and also about the idea of sexual fluidity as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, I think that Shere perceived that things kind of got harder as time went on, and I think looking back, we can kind of see partially why, right? Like when people come so hard at you from, you know, there was so much cultural opposition to her, and I think people don't want that rubbing off on them. You know, it makes them afraid, and it can make them push against things irrationally or against their own best interest, and that definitely started to happen. And I really wanted to try to conjure the time that Shere remembered and her friends remembered of kind of before that, you know, before there was a backlash, when things were really audacious, like that amazing protest at the Museum of Natural History, where the signs look like something that would be today, like it's the same language. I don't think we remember that there was so much talk of intersectionality. I don't think there was there's a memory that movement was pulling together and looking at things from so many different perspectives, or that there was that much kind of like goofy, wonderful creativity, you know? And I think all those things are really important to successful movements, and that movement was really successful in so many ways, you know? So I tried to kind of not focus too much on the infighting. I had remembered something Gloria Steinem had written about that series, Mrs. America, which I really like, but you know, there was sort of a criticism of the focusing on the kind of infighting, which, you know, sometimes I think can not be the most productive way to look at movements. And at the same time, you know, yeah, there was evidence of that everywhere, and I think Shere particularly suffered for it because, as Bob Gottlieb said, you know, that was who she was, and she was uncompromising on that. She never compromised on that, you know, and never would succumb to trying to make herself, you know, look more serious or conform to what people thought a serious person should look like. And I think people distanced themselves from her, you know, because of that, and it was really painful. But there were people like Kate Millett, you know, who really stuck by her. And actually Gloria Steinem and a number of other feminists even wrote a letter to the editor in the New York Times when she was really attacked after the women's book, and stood up for her. And Susan Faludi called it out for what it was in the Backlash book. So there were also examples of people standing by her. But yeah, it is tough to see.
Okay, Nicole, thank you so much for being here with us and giving us so much more insight into your beautiful film. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Have a great night.